What is Friedrich Nietzsche's view of tragedy? Maybe that doesn't sound like an interesting question, but I think that the answer to that question really unlocks Nietzsche. I've been reading him for years, and it really wasn't until I finished his first published book, I believe, The Birth of Tragedy, that I feel like I now have a pretty good grasp on what's going on. And when did I finish that book, you ask? Well, minutes ago. I just finished it. So some of this is fresh thought, some of it is maybe based on other readings or reflections on him. But it's really important if you want to understand Nietzsche to understand his book, The Birth of Tragedy. So if you're at this point in the video, I'm going to ask you to be a little bit patient, listen for a little bit longer, because I think if you do, it will unlock Nietzsche, at least for you to a degree, and I think that you'll be better off if you're interested in him by knowing what I'm about to say. So, first of all, this book, The Birth of Tragedy, is it's actually got The Birth of Tragedy out of the spirit of music. It's published in 1872, and actually in 1886 he re-releases it with a preface. And in my mind, that preface is hugely important because it kind of explains, how Nietzsche integrates his original work into his larger philosophical project. In terms of what the book's about, the two editors of the edition that I have, Raymond Geis and Ronald Spears, explain the book as an attempt to use theses derived from Schopenhauer and Wagner in conjunction with an interpretation of archaic Greece to sketch out a new form of tragic culture. So in particular, Schopenhauer is used by Nietzsche to say, yes, I'm very pessimistic about the world. Life is not worth living. So pessimism in the more big picture sense of you can't justify life. It is not worth living. And yet he has this sort of aesthetic, artful mysticism from Richard Wagner, this aesthetics idea. And for Nietzsche, this is so important because the only justification for life, for existence, for the world, is aesthetics. It's an aesthetic phenomenon. It's a huge emphasis. He actually mentions it in the preface as well in 1886. Like, it's pretty clear that that's what he's attempting to do in this book. The Birth of Tragedy, therefore, aims to really justify existence, given the reality of pessimism, that the world lacks any sort of essential goodness. In Nietzsche's own words, quote, the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. For Nietzsche in his Birth of Tragedy, then, that justification involves a union between, and this is where it gets maybe a little bit weird, but you kind of got to listen. It's a union between a primary Dionysic energy and the illusion of shine, which is a sort of Apolline urge. Okay, so what's he doing here? Well, he's looking back at Greece and looks at the gods Dionysius and Apollo, gods, I guess, associated with the arts, and he says they actually are representative of a sort of human psychological reality, that there's some sort of primordial will and urging in us towards life. That's the Apolline urge. That needs to mix with a sort of Dionysic, I don't know, you would say that it's more music, it's more aesthetic, it's more unity, and all this kind of stuff. There's these two urges. I'll talk about that in a second. But they need to work together to make life tolerable. Because if you sort of ignore the Apolline epic speech, words, and individualism that entails, then you don't have any story to tell yourself about why life is worth living. But you do need some story. You need some illusion. You need some representation, some figment, some imaginary story. Or else, essentially, it's better to not exist. And for Nietzsche, he believes that was the ancient Greek view. That was sort of common sense. So he has this really important citation that on page 23 of my edition, that he cites of a conversation with King Midas with the wise Silenus, and it's a daemon, and the daemon says, "Wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and tribulation, why do you force me to tell you the very thing which it would be most profitable for you not to hear? The very best thing is utterly beyond your reach, not to have been born, not to be nothing. However, the second best thing for you is to die soon." And Nietzsche actually thinks that probably is wise. He doesn't think, in fact, that life is worth living. You can't justify life as such unless you create an illusion to give it meaning. So, this is this Apolline urge to existence, to individuality, to meaning, to epic speech, all this kind of stuff that is in sort of the Greek world. And so he emphasizes that's really important, and the Greeks did too, and that's what you find in these Greek tragedies. Now, I better talk really briefly then about this Dionysius idea. So, Apolline, whatever urges, is focused on words, individuality, borders, all this kind of stuff, boundaries for life. But it really is it's an illusion. By contrast, the Dionysiac whatever urge, it lacks individuality. It's full of music, it's full of danger, and it's interestingly full of danger because it points to reality. Nietzsche says, our individual identity is an illusion. And it's really interesting. It very much does point to reality. For example, on page 80 of the edition that I'm using, Nietzsche says, Dionysic universality, in contrast to the individuality of Apollo. Anyways, it goes on and talks about it. And this Dionysic universality and so on causes the symbolic image to emerge with its highest degree of significance. And then on the very next page, he talks about music in particular, music without words in context. Music is the immediate idea of this life. And there's this sense in which he thinks this irrational, instinctual, verbless feeling of oneness connected to the primordial oneness or will of everything is at heart what it is to be. And you don't really exist as an individual. Everything else is basically an illusion. And there's not a huge point to everything. So you need this Apolline, this Apolline notion of meaning. Okay, so that's a sort of psychological description. So when he comes to ancient Greece, he views it as this noble culture that figured this out, that essentially non-existence is fact. Pessimism is a fact. And yet, in his preface, he talks about this pessimism as maybe being like a pessimistic strength in the ancient Greek sense. But you recognize that, and then you have to kind of create this sort of epic speech and this sort of illusion of individuality, illusion of a life worth living. So that is kind of how he views, ancient Greece. But then curious is that, of course, we don't live like that today. We live in a decadent society. So what happens? Well, he believes already in the 5th century BC, things begin to fall apart. And there's a decay that happens. And a symptom of that decay is Socratism. So Socrates, the great philosopher, recognizes there's big problems happening in the world around him in Greece, and in order to solve that, he uses discourse, reason. He has a discursive method, a question and answer. But actually, he's just sick, Nietzsche thinks. He's part of this symptom of decline. And he recognizes there is a decline. Socrates recognizes a decline, but he has the wrong solution. Nietzsche, of course, has the right one, is what he would say. If you want to see more on this, you can read his Twilight of the Idols, where he argues that Socrates himself wanted to die. He's sort of in love with death, with non-existence. In that way, he's a nihilist. But he didn't need to. Socrates should have given up his rationalism, essentially. And then after this impulse of Socrates, you have Christianity, which is a later symptom of decadence. If you want to read more on this, you can read his book, The Antichrist, which is, kind of straightforward. Interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, in his book, I should double check that, doesn't he call, I think he calls the Dionysian urge an Antichrist urge. But anyways, we'll keep reading. And these are attractive illusions, Socrates, Christianity, because the alternative to these illusions, these representations of a life worth living and avoiding death, even if it's through rules and revelation, well, the alternative is just death. So Nietzsche kind of recognizes that, but he sees the rationalism of philosophy and the revelation of Christianity and its rules as being basically a weakness, a decadence. And by the time he writes his 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy, he ends up modifying his view a little bit. As I noted, he speaks about a pessimism of strength. And he means something like this: although life is not worth living, pessimism, we can still pursue life and instinct, quote, from an abundance of existence. But he apparently, retains his pessimistic view at large. And yet, interestingly enough, Nietzsche calls himself an advocate of life, who formed a doctrine and counter-evaluation of life. And this counter-evaluation he calls the Dionysiac. So he has a revaluation of morals, which is something we're not talking about now, but just so you know, he basically reevaluates good and evil, kind of goes beyond it, which is connected to his whole resentment idea. But anyways, and this doctrine that he kind of creates is artistic, and it rejects supremely Christianity. This is right. He does say this. The Dionysiac could just as well be called the Antichrist. So essentially, this Dionysiac urge, drive, unity, this borderlessness, whatever it is, this kind of close to reality through music, wordless stuff in us, needs to be balanced by the Apolline to make life tolerable. But actually, that's how the editors of this book put it. And that's good, but why does it have to be against Christianity? And I think that's one of the confusing things in Nietzsche's argument that's hard to understand. But I think if I read a long quote of his, it might give you some insight why philosophy and then Christianity as a follow-up to it are viewed so negatively by Nietzsche. The basic idea, before I read the quote, is that the Socratic rational moral way of life is really in Nietzsche's language, a hostility to life and a will to decline, because you're no longer living by instinct or by passion or by immediacy. You're not close to the verb and close to reality. You're creating reason, rationality, discourse, rules, notions. All of this is an illusion. Things like intellect and will, in terms of like a faculty psychology, it's all illusion, just a name. In this sense, he's also sort of a nominalist in the medieval sense, to a degree. So consider this kind of long criticism of Christianity by Nietzsche, namely that Christianity is kind of nihilistic, and Nietzsche's view is Dionysiac. So here's what he says. He says, in truth, there is no greater antithesis of the purely aesthetic exegesis and justification of the world as taught in this book than the Christian doctrine, which is and wants to be only moral, and which, with its absolute criteria, its insistence on God's truthfulness, for example, banishes all art, to the realm of lies, and thus negates, damns, and condemns it. Behind this way of thinking and evaluating, which is bound to be hostile to art, if it is all genuine, I have always felt its hostility to life, a furious, vengeful enmity towards life itself. For all life rests on semblance, so semblance being this illusion that we talked about earlier, art, deception, prismatic effects, the necessity of perspectivalism and error. From the very outset, Christianity was essentially and pervasively the feeling of disgust and weariness which life felt for life, a feeling which merely disguised, hid, and decked itself out in its belief in another or better life. Hatred of the world, a curse on the passions, fear of beauty and sensuality, a beyond invented in order to better to defame the here and now, fundamentally a desire for nothingness, for the end, for rest, for the Sabbath of Sabbaths. All this, together with the determination of Christianity to sanction only moral values, seemed to me the most dangerous and uncanny of all possible forms of a will to decline. At the very least, a sign of the most profound sickness, tiredness, distemper, exhaustion, improvement of life. For before the chord of morality, especially Christian, which is to say unconditional morality, life must constantly and inevitably be proved wrong, because life is essentially something immoral. Life must eventually, crushed by the weight of contempt and the eternal no, be felt to be inherently unworthy, undeserving of our desire. Morality itself, might it not be a will to negate life, a secret instinct for annihilation, a principle of decay, belittlement, calumny, the beginning of the end, and consequently the greatest danger of all? Thus my instinct turned against morality at the time I wrote this questionable book. As an advocate of life, my instinct invented for itself a fundamentally opposed doctrine and counter-evaluation of life, a purely artistic one, anti-Christian one. What was it to be called? As a philologist and a man of words, I baptized it not without certain liberty, for who can know the true name of the Antichrist? By the name of a Greek god, I called it Dionysiac. The key to understanding this long quote by Nietzsche is to see Christianity as another illusion, like the Apolline illusion, that attempts to be a medicine for society's ills, but it does it through sort of a destruction for all that life truly is in this Dionysiac tone. Rather than the balance in the Greek tragedy, both Greek philosophy and Christianity suppress all that really life is. It's at base nihilistic. That's why in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche says that Plato wanted to die. That's why Christians, he says, want to go to heaven. They actually don't like life. And yes, interestingly enough, Nietzsche admits that life is sort of meaningless and not worth justifying, except if you can get close and you can kind of allow the two wolves in you, the Dionysiac and the Apolline wolf, I guess, to sort of work together into a pack. And you can balance these things and create an illusion that makes sense for individuality and for life itself through the aesthetic arts of music and speech. Music being the sort of closeness to reality, this kind of Wagnerian closeness to reality. It's very Dionysiac. But then you also have the need for an Apolline, verbal, bordered kind of illusion as well. And that can be balanced out through Greek tragedy. The problem, essentially, with Greek philosophy and Christianity is a complete hatred of this Dionysiac drive of passion and instinct in place of, let's say, reason in Plato or Socrates, and revelation and rules and morality in Christianity. So, what exactly then is the positive vision of the Dionysiac? Well, you'd have to read his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, because Zarathustra is the prophet of the Dionysiac. He is the one who comes to deliver the goods. I will stop here, but in summary, the importance of tragedy in Nietzsche, to understand him, is that tragedy, Greek tragedy, before Plato, Socrates, was the sort of union of Apollo and Dionysius, these urges inside of all people, and it allowed you to get close to life, to recognize that life isn't worth living, and yet to create an illusion, I guess, close to reality that allows you to love life, because we have this, even though life's not worth, we can't justify it, we still somehow have this instinctual drive based on the will, this primordial will to live. And so he's trying to justify why we want to live. Whether or not that makes sense to you, well, that's the fun part of Nietzsche. He doesn't always make sense, but he's always at least fun to read. I will almost certainly be back with more Nietzsche. I might do some reading on here through the Twilight of the Idols and some other books of his. Please do subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.